I want to talk to you today about the positive power of the tongue. In case you've just joined us, I've been looking at the third chapter of James in recent weeks, and what James has to say about the tongue is largely negative. He says the tongue is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole person and sets the whole course of his life on fire and is of itself set on fire by hell. And he goes on to say the tongue is poison, and so much is negative. But there's a verse in Proverbs that says, the tongue has the power of life and death, and those who love it will eat its fruit. Proverbs 18, verse 21. So I want to talk to you about the positive power of the tongue. I'll never forget, once at Westminster Chapel, a widowed lady named Joyce. She's now in heaven. But she came into me in the vestry, I'll never forget it, very, very distraught. Her second husband had recently died. And her first husband, whom she married when she was very young, had been cruel to her and utterly rejected her. But she received love and enjoyed the great companionship with her second husband, who had just died. Well, she had not been converted very long, and she wanted to confess to me that she was doing something she didn't think it was very right to do. She felt guilty that she, now a Christian, because she had just been converted as well, was going back again and again to the crematorium where she had said her final goodbye to her husband. Well, here's what she said. I know I shouldn't do this, and I feel so awful, but I've never been so grieved. I've never felt so grieved. And he loved me. And I go back, and as I looked at her in all my years at Westminster, I don't know that I'd ever seen such distress, at least for a long time. And I felt desperate for her. And I began to cry out to the Lord in her behalf. I said, Lord, give me something for Joyce, please. Either a word of wisdom, a word of knowledge. I was desperate. I felt so sorry for her, and I felt I've got to do something to make her feel better. Lord, please give me something that will encourage her. You know, she's come to me thinking that I'm going to have a word from you. I'll tell you what, this has not happened to me before, just like that. In all the 25 years in London, it happened one time, but it did happen then. When, as I'm talking to her, suddenly a verse of Scripture came into my mind. It was Isaiah chapter 54, verse 6. Well, I didn't have the courage to ask Joyce to turn to this verse. I didn't have faith. So what I did, I turned to it myself while I kept talking to her, and I wanted to see what was this Isaiah 54, verse 6. And when I saw it, I was astonished. When I read it myself, then I said, I want to read something to you. I said, Joyce, I was praying for you as you were speaking, and I begged the Lord to give me something, and Isaiah chapter 54, verse 6 just came to my mind, and I'd like to read it to you. And here's what it says. The Lord will call you back as if you were a deserted and distressed wife, a wife deserted. And here she was, a wife who married young only to be rejected. And it goes on to say this. Let me read the whole verse. The Lord will call you back as if you are a wife deserted and distressed in spirit, a wife who married young, that was Joyce, only to be rejected, says your God. She looked at me. What made you read that verse to me? she asked with amazement. I was more amazed than she was. I told her that I begged the Lord to give me something because I felt, and I said, the Holy Spirit. I know it had to be the Holy Spirit. Seconds before, just put into my mind Isaiah 54, verse 6. I had no idea what it said until I turned to it. She said, are you saying to me that the Lord gave you that verse right now? I said, that's exactly what I'm saying. A radiant smile came on her face. She was thrilled that God would do that for her. She left the vestry with great relief and joy. And I was just as happy as she was because that had never happened to me before. You know, there's a verse in the Proverbs says, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. Proverbs 25, verse 11, especially such a word is perceived if it's perceived as being from God. When you can get a word that you know is from God in the time of trouble, there's nothing like it. Well, now, you know, preaching should always do that. This talk I'm giving, I'd like to think it would do that. We've been several weeks talking about controlling the tongue, and I'd like to think my talks do that. I'm not sure they always do, but I wanted to do that for her, and God did it. And I want to do that as I speak today, because truth emancipates, sets people free. John 8:32. And where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 17. Well, now look, I have to tell you, I could take no credit for that word to Joyce. I had nothing to do with it, nothing. But I should wish that my words would do this for people. I've prayed over the years that when I speak, I could speak in a way that Jesus affirmed people and encouraged them, and I want to do that. And I would like to think I'm doing that right now, that somebody, you've just tuned in and you would like a word from God. And I just hope that what I say today will give you a sense of significance as Jesus would. And I want you to sense God's approval. Well, now, many of these talks have been negative because when you deal with the power of the tongue, I'd have to say most that the Bible has to say about the tongue is negative. But I want to say as strongly as I can that it is equally true that the tongue has positive power indeed, tremendous potential to bless and encourage. You know, it's amazing how the slightest word, whether spoken directly to us or hearing it secondhand, can catapult our self-image and self-esteem either toward a feeling of confidence or one of despair. I've written a book called Thanking God. The American edition is called Just Say Thanks. And you can read the details in the book. My grandma, McCurley, my mother's mother, changed a young black student's entire life by one brief sentence that she gave to him. And this was many years ago back in Springfield, Illinois. My grandma taught school. Before she was Mrs. McCurley, married my grandpa McCurley, an Irishman, her name was Maddox, Lottie Maddox, and she taught school. And there was this one student, black student in the school where she taught, who was difficult, unruly, and always getting in fights with kids out on the playground and in the class, and she was racking her brain, what can I say to him? And she thought of something that might help because she says, I happen to know this is a very clever little boy. And so he was in difficulty because he got into another fight. And she said, I want to talk to you a little bit. Here's what she said. You have a good mind. And no one had ever said that to him before. She was his teacher, noted how he was so angry when the white boys ganged up on him. He wanted vengeance upon these boys more than anything in the world. And my grandma simply told him that the best way for him to get vengeance upon those boys was to get a good education. Let me tell you something. It worked. No one had ever affirmed him before. She said, you've got a good mind. You can go places. Well, I'll tell you something. Years later, he became a state senator in Illinois, the first black person to be a senator in the state of Illinois. Some 30 years or more after that incident, when my grandmother was Lottie Maddox, taught him, one day, 30 years later, she gets a phone call from the Capitol building and said, are you Mrs. McCurley, are you the former Lottie Maddox? And said, yes. Well, I can tell you that Senator so-and-so is going to have a special banquet, and you are invited to be a special guest. Well, she didn't have any idea what this could mean. She had no idea. And who do you say? Well, they gave his name, Senator so-and-so. Said, apparently, you taught him when he was a little boy. And we're having a banquet for the senator, and we asked him who would he like to have sitting at the head table with him that had meant a lot to him. Oh, he said, I can tell you who I would like you to get if you can find her. It was a Miss Maddox when I was 6 years old. And they traced her down, and finally they got a hold of her. And they asked her, did you teach this little boy? Well, yes, I certainly did. He's right now a state senator. Well, she didn't know that. Here's the thing. She was now invited to be a special guest. He publicly affirmed those words by her to him as the turning point in his life. And now she's sitting at the table. She vividly remembered this conversation but had no clue that she made such an impact on that young boy until many years later, this senator invites her to this banquet. You know, it just goes to show our words, whether casual, intentional, serious, or even in jest, can transform a person's morale. Well, God weighs His words with us. He often speaks to us merely to affirm us, but sadly sometimes we disregard it, maybe because of our low self-esteem or our low estimate of our own spirituality or our walk with God. But He sees in all of us a diamond in the rough. And He regards us as gold that only needs to be refined. True motivation for holy living stems from the way God sees us in His Son, Jesus Christ. In fact, the biblical doctrine of justification by faith stems from the concept, the Apostle Paul calls it imputed righteousness. That means the way God sees us, not the way we see ourselves, or not the way we feel about ourselves, but therefore the way God sees us. And He says something to us that affirms us. We're wise to believe Him, however hard it may be to accept his evaluation of us. For example, God said to Gideon, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." It's in Judges chapter 6, verse 12. God saw Gideon as a man of valor and courage. Well, that's not the way Gideon felt about himself. He began arguing back with the Lord. He says, "God, how can you say that? You say to me, go in the strength you have and save Israel." And he says, God says, "Am I not sending you?" But Gideon disagreed. He said, "How can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the least in my family." Judges 6:15. You see, some of us have inferiority complexes because of where we were born or where we were brought up. You may recall, if you've watched many times, I come from Kentucky. And being from Kentucky, I might tell you, growing up in Kentucky, when there were only 48 states, I'll tell you a kind of funny story, but it's true. In the days when there were only 48 states, there are now 50, but there were 48. And when I grew up in those days in Kentucky, we had a slogan. The slogan was, "Thank God for Arkansas." The reason for that Kentucky was 47th in educational standards out of the 48 states. Arkansas was 48th. They were at the bottom, so we said, "Thank God for Arkansas," or we would be at the very bottom. Well, I was brought up in Kentucky, one from Arkansas, which was at the very bottom of the American states when it came to educational standards. In other words, Kentucky would have been at the bottom, but for Arkansas, we say, "Thank God for Arkansas." Now, there is no doubt that rubbed off on me. There's no doubt. And I imagine if I said I was from Kentucky, people would look down their noses at me, and some actually did. Well, now, that is the way Gideon felt. He said, "My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." But God saw him differently. God says, "You are a mighty warrior." Now, it was his family and background that contributed to the feeling of inferiority. You know, in my early days in school in Ashland, Kentucky, I heard something that changed my life, and not for good. I heard my teacher when I was 10 years old. I was in the 5th grade in Ashland, Kentucky. Here's what happened. When I was in grades 1, 2, 3, 4, for some reason I made straight A's. I did. But when I got into the 5th grade and had a new teacher, suddenly, instead of getting A's, I was getting B's and C's. And my father says, "What's going wrong? You always made A's." And I said, "Well, I'm working as hard as I don't know what it is." But I heard my teacher say about me, I wish I hadn't heard it. Here's what she said: "RT is not an A student." Do you know, I wish I hadn't heard that. I believed that for years, but I'm just not an A student. I could never make an A. I was convinced from then on I'd always be a B or C student. And I was precisely that throughout my years, all the way through high school, and even in my early years at Trevecca Nazarene College, a B and C student. I was locked into this fixed mentality and perception of myself for a long time. Well, how did I eventually get over it? 2 things. First, my dad once said to me, "RT, you have the intelligence to become the governor of this state." That sounded pretty good, even if it was Kentucky, governor of Kentucky. I struggled to believe it, but I always kept it in mind, and I hung on to my dad's words. Second, my professor of theology at Trevecca, Dr. William Greathouse, would actually treat me, believe it or not, as if I were his peer. I don't know why, but he made me feel that I was as bright as he was. And he would make it clear he valued my point of view, and it gave me confidence. And here's the thing, we're talking about the power of a positive word. My teacher in the 5th grade said, RT is not an A student. It affected me, and I almost never got over it. But then eventually, a positive word made me feel all the better. It just goes to show that our words have power, and the power of life and death. Well, I'm hoping that as I speak, this might encourage you. Watch what you say to people. Now, you may recall, if you were watching the last time, I gave this acrostic, N-E-E-D, need. Ask yourself this question. We all need encouragement. You have the power to encourage. And I've had occasion to refer to Dale Carnegie's famous book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And he says the greatest urge in any of us is the need to feel important. And we should do our best to make another person feel important. Now, I realize this might be a special gift, but I would challenge you to see if that gift is in you. Start making feel people important. God made Gideon feel important and says, you're a man of valor. He argued back, but he believed the word. Now, when you want to make a person feel important, be careful. Don't flatter them. Don't go over the top. Simply look into their eyes. Treat them with respect. They will feel from you that you regard them as important. You know, we must do this with our children, our friends, our peers, your pastor, your vicar, your teacher. Can you recall a person saying a positive word to you that was timely and pivotal in your life at the time? You know, I would not want you to be contrived, not for a second, but if you were to make it your goal to speak blessings, encouraging things to people, you've no idea how God might use this. I cannot urge this strongly enough to parents. Encourage your children, build them up, express to them that you believe they are capable, valued, that they can do what they set their hearts on. I can tell you, if I myself could turn the clock back, I would not only spend more time with each of our 2 children, but I would make it my goal to instill a high level of confidence in them. Now, we must not, however, as I said, fall into the trap of flattering people or giving false encouragement. But if you can think of what is both truthful and encouraging to someone, say it. This may surprise you, but I can tell you categorically that ministers, preachers, teachers, church leaders, followers, whether low profile, high profile, secretary, dentist, doctor, solicitor, politician, taxi driver, computer geniuses, high profile people, those in authority, love and appreciate encouragement. Do you know, the 16th chapter of Romans, book of Romans, Paul's longest letter, it's his most doctrinal letter, but when you get to the 16th chapter, a whole chapter, have you ever thought about this? If you've read Romans, Paul spends the whole chapter mentioning people and calling their names, often telling why they were appreciated. Now, if you believe in the infallibility of the Bible, I do, and you take the Scriptures seriously, I pray that you will, well, when you think of Romans, you probably don't think of the non-doctrinal part of Romans, chapter 4 and 5, justification by faith. Chapter 7, a person under the law. Chapter 8, being set free. 9, predestination. 10, preaching the gospel to everybody. 11, God's plan for Israel. In other words, it's all doctrinal. But at the very end, same epistle, he was inspired to encourage people by name. Therefore, read Romans 16, probably the least known chapter of that magnificent book. What a thrill it must have been to see one's name in a parchment like that, or to hear the great Apostle Paul remember their name. Well, we all need encouragement. And I'm trying to show that whereas the tongue can be negative and be a fire and set a forest on fire, and a tongue can be poisonous and it can make someone sick, a tongue can be used for good and bless people, build them up. And that's what God did to Gideon. That's what Jesus did. That's what you and I can do. Be a blessing. Set them free. Affirm them. Well, that's it for today. God bless you until next time.